Unitarian Universalist minister. Right? We can be kind of wily like that. It was late October in 1553, and a man wearing dirty, lice-covered clothes shuffled along. He was followed in a procession that included horses, dogs, cops, and most of the town of Geneva. Pastors walked next to him, one whispering in his ear, calling on him to recant, to confess his sins. He was one of Europe's most prominent physicians and thinkers, and he was being executed for publishing a book that redefined Christianity. His name was Michael Servetus, and when he was tied to a stake, they surrounded him by green wood and bound what was thought to be the last copy of his book, The Restoration of Christianity, to his body. He died for his beliefs. A man of science and reason, he had placed his faith in a God that didn't rely on scientific proofs, but rather his own calling and his own understanding of the divine, and his call to live a life of integrity. Servetus died because he was not willing to give up what he believed was right and true. He died because he was a Unitarian. And that is the end of Michael's story. The beginning of his story is centuries before his birth. Unitarianism goes back to the life of Jesus. Unitarians didn't start as heretics. We were just a minority approach to Christianity. And then in 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine wanted to unite his lands under a single version of the many views of Christianity that were floating around at the time. He brought together a number of theologians and told them to come to some conclusions. For Constantine, it was largely politics. He knew people fought better for a cause. A united Christianity would give them one. When the Council of Nicaea was formed, Arius was our guy at the table. He was a Liberian bishop at the time and felt that while God was eternal, Jesus was created by God and was subordinate to God and not divine, or not as divine as the Father. But Arius lost. In fact, some stories tell us he was punched out by St. Nicholas and kicked out of the council. In the end, the central result was that the Council of Nicaea was the declaration of the Holy Trinity. Arius was exiled. This marked a significant shift in a Christianity that had once held a multitude of beliefs, including the idea that God was one rather than three in one. Come forward over 1,000 years, and Michael Servetus was born into a noble family in the early 1500s in Spain. At the time he was born, Catholicism believed in the power of relics and indulgences. By touching a relic or purchasing an indulgence, a person would greatly reduce their time or the time of a relative in purgatory, in some cases by thousands of years. For example, there was a coin claimed to have been paid to Judas, the guy who betrayed Jesus, which, if touched, would reduce the time in purgatory by 1,400 years. Right? That sounds like a deal. People would pay to purchase indulgences. And this was also a world that was about to see widespread use of the printing press. When Michael was a child, a priest and theologian named Martin Luther posted his 95 theses on the church door at Wittenberg. These were statements objecting to the use of indulgences and related church practices. Young Michael saw a powerful man who thought carefully about his faith and worked to change how people around him saw religion. Martin Luther's actions changed the world and had a profound impact on Michael's life. The oldest of three brothers, Michael was a genius. His father supported his brilliant son's education, and by the time he became a teenager, he knew several languages, including Hebrew, which was a forbidden language that he had to learn in secret. At 13, Michael was sent to university by his father. He quickly came to the attention of Juan Quintana, the most important member of the faculty. Quintana made Michael his personal secretary and exposed him to not only assigned texts, but also classics and contemporary writers such as Martin Luther. When he was 16, Michael's father sent him to a different university to study law. This would earn him a degree that would place him well in society. His father also felt that this would protect Michael from the reforms that were shaking the rest of the world. What the elders in young Michael's life didn't know was this university had become a hotbed of radicalism. The students at the university read books that had been outlawed, books that spoke against specific aspects of Catholicism. They turned to unapproved versions of the Bible, including the original Greek and Hebrew as well as Latin. Servetus came to the conclusion that Rome had corrupted the text and tenets of Christianity. And by the age of 19, Servetus had gained a remarkable understanding of the Bible. He learned Arabic so he could also study the Quran. And he grew used to correcting the errors of others in their translations. You see the coming problem. He began to write a book, correcting what he saw as the errors in Christianity. He felt called to use his intelligence and integrity to try to repair the faith he loved and to dismantle some of the abuses of power that he saw around him. Eventually, Michael decided, despite being warned of the danger by his friends, to find a publisher for the book he titled On the Errors of the Trinity. He wasn't shy. He wrote, "I say, therefore, that God himself is our spirit dwelling in us, and this is the Holy Spirit within us. In this we testify that there is in our spirit a certain working latent energy, a certain heavenly sense, a latent divinity, and it bloweth where it listeth, and I hear its voice, and I know not whence it comes or whither it goes. So is everyone that is born in the Spirit of God." He insisted to his friends that he could personally disprove the notion of the Trinity and therefore undermine the entire rotten structure on which stood the power of Rome. Dangerous words. He pointed out that the concept of the Trinity was nowhere to be found in the original biblical manuscripts. His book also put forth the idea that God was within all of us. And this was radical because it implied people didn't need an intercessor, a go-between, a minister, the church, to stand between them and God. A man of reason and intellectual rigor, Michael put everything on the line to live a calling to share his faith. He knew it was dangerous to challenge the common orthodoxy of the time. He knew people were being jailed for heretical beliefs. Still, heretical books were popular, so his did well. His work was discussed, refuted, and resulted in his arrest within a year. He escaped custody and was sentenced to death in absentia by the Inquisition. If Michael hadn't known it before, he knew it now. There was a cost to acting and sharing one's beliefs. He could have renounced his own work, his own calling. He could have hidden. He could have stopped exploring the world around him. And he did run. He fled to Lyon and changed his last name to Villanovos. There he worked on books on geography and astronomy, but was naturally drawn to other reformers and continued to engage others in discussion. When he got in trouble again, he fled to Paris, where he grew interested in medicine and enrolled in medical school, like you do. During his time there, Michael was arrested under his new name for teaching astrology, but confidently talked his way out of any serious trouble. While he was working as a doctor, he discovered how the pulmonary system works and once again challenged the traditional understanding of the time. Yet even his work on bloodstream was a part of his theological work. He argued that the soul resided in the bloodstream, so we needed to understand the pulmonary system in order to understand our soul. Just as his theological views challenged church orthodoxy, his medical views challenged medical orthodoxy. Can you imagine it? He's now been in serious trouble several times, including being sentenced to death. Are there beliefs that you value so much you would put everything on the line for them? Is there a place you would stand and defend, even at the risk to your own life? Servetus was admittedly nervous by this time and focused on the study of medicine and his work as a doctor. For a while, he was even going to Mass and avoiding theological debate. But eventually, he was drawn back into an apparently irresistible theological debate when he agreed to edit an edition of the Bible. It's like you all know him already. Goldstone says, the first Servetus edition of the Pagini Bible was actually rather tame, sticking largely to the traditional interpretation of the scriptures. However, he could not resist in the beginning putting a part where he criticized Bible scholars for not accepting the scriptures in their literal form, but instead insisting on seeking more mystical meanings. In his translation of the next edition, a 7-volume set, he caused a little more trouble. He corrected the mistranslation of Hebrew and replaced virgin with young marriageable woman. I can tell that you can imagine how well this went over. The books were restricted and banned by the Inquisition. At the same time, Servetus was sharing ideas that people are basically good, that God is in all things, that Jesus was a child of God just like you and I. And another theologian you may have heard of, John Calvin, was preaching the ideas of predestination and that people were inherently evil. It's no wonder that he and Servetus seemed to dislike each other from the beginning. After their first meeting, Servetus and Calvin wrote letters back and forth to one another, debating theology. While Servetus was in hiding, Calvin had gained control of Geneva. And no, I don't know how they wrote letters to each other while Servetus was in hiding. Calvin was a harsh man, instituting serious punishments in Geneva for things like dancing, smiling, or laughing at inappropriate times. Kid you not. The two men irritated each other quite a bit in their disagreements, and Calvin eventually stopped writing back. Frustrated, Servetus began writing insulting notes in Calvin's books and sending them to him. As a result, Calvin tried several times to get Servetus arrested in France, using his own letters as proof of his heresy as well as evidence that he was Michael Servetus. In 1552, Servetus' response was to print a book that was a direct attack on Calvin's own writings. It was called The Restoration of Christianity. And it was his attempt to draw Christianity back into what he saw as right relationship with God. And just in case Calvin doubted who this argument was directed at, Servetus included the texts of their letters, and then went on to imply that anyone who disagreed with him was an idiot. Eventually, and perhaps not surprisingly, Servetus was arrested, but escaped again by jumping off the balcony outside his room. Remember, he was a noble, so they were treated a little differently when they were arrested. As he fled to safety, Michael Servetus, for reasons we may never know, decided to travel through Geneva. Yes, Geneva, where Calvin was. When Michael went to church, because skipping was illegal, He was spotted by Calvin and arrested on August 13th of 1553. He was put on trial and used his time in court to engage in theological and legal debate with the prosecutor. And eventually Calvin, who had been attending, couldn't stand it anymore. He entered the trial, and both men were brilliant and well-versed in scholarship. They argued theology back and forth. But Servetus had already lost. The trial had always been for show. He just didn't know it. On October 27th, Michael Servetus was found guilty of 2 of the 15 charges that Calvin had set against him. He was sentenced to be burned at the stake. Calvin wrote a letter to try to get Servetus beheaded instead, which was admittedly an easier way to die, but his request was rejected. When Servetus was executed, Calvin stayed home. The public's reaction to the execution surprised Calvin. There were many who said it had gone too far. There was an outcry that caused him to eventually write a paper explaining why Servetus had to be killed. But Michael Servetus' ideas were already out there. His call for more tolerant, inclusive, Unitarian Christianity spread. You see, when Servetus was killed, they burned what they thought was the last copy of his book, but 3 survived, hidden away by people who risked their own lives and freedom to protect his ideas. Michael Servetus lived and died for his faith, for his passionate love of Unitarian Christianity. He's a Unitarian martyr. He died for his commitment to what he believed was true about Christianity. But I would like to suggest that more important than dying for what he believed was the fact that he lived for what he believed. This brilliant, socially awkward young man truly lived into the beauty of his faith and the importance of truth and reason. He believed that we could discuss our differences. Of course, he also ultimately thought we should all come to believe as he did. But don't we all feel that way sometimes when we're sure that what we believe is vitally, perhaps even eternally important? In his life, Michael Servetus sought to help others have a more authentic relationship with God. My beloved spiritual companions, this is the legacy that Michael leaves us. A Unitarian spiritual ancestor who took a stand for his faith, for something he found valuable and important. He died for it, but he lived for it too. His life challenges us to continue to seek truth, to love this faith, and to live for something of worth. May it be so. Amen.